Good morning. My name's Maria McNamara and I'm the CEO of Advance.org. We're the platform that connects global Australians with one another and with Australia. Today I'm joined by Mark Adams, a Bay Area-based Australian entrepreneur. He's the Managing Director of Unreal HiTech and a podcast host of Recruiting Reimagined, which is presented by Curious Thing. Good morning, Mark.
Hi Maria, how are you?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for making the time.
My pleasure.
You've got a real interest, Mark, in the future of work and recruiting, and you've got the focus on AI and how it'll impact our careers over the next 20 years. It is probably the hottest topic at the moment, with all attention being focused on it as a result of the pandemic.
Yep.
But let me take you back. Let me ask you about the key elements of your career to date. What's led you to this point? What's led you to this area of practice?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, number one, I've always wanted to work overseas. I've always been fascinated. I remember my first overseas trip as a child was to Hong Kong when I was 8. And ever since then, I actually wanted to work in Hong Kong. For the first part of my career was pretty regular. I worked for Optus and James Hardie, which is a pretty iconic Australian company, or it was at that time. LG Electronics. But then I got the chance to work with a startup when, at that point in my career, I was about sort of 10 or 15 years into my career, and the thought of working for a startup was really intriguing because the concept of being an entrepreneur really wasn't like it is here. I mean, my kids today here in the US, they just breathe that in because that's just, one of the things that might be your career option. But the idea of working for a startup was really, really interesting. I didn't know anything about it. But I think the fact that I didn't know anything about it helped me to make the decision, because if I did, and if I knew what was going to happen and knew how hard it was going to be, I probably would have had second thoughts. But I took the leap of faith and moved to Hong Kong with this company that had 7 employees. And most of them were in Sweden and Stockholm, actually. So very, had an Australian person end up in Hong Kong working for a Swedish company. That's just, how the world works these days. But so I was in Hong Kong and right at the global financial crisis as well. So it was a really, really interesting time to be in Asia. And it cemented my love of seeing things grow and of technology and of also, Australia's engagement with the Asia Pacific region. That's, I've got to see firsthand China. I first went to China, believe it or not, in 1982. And then, all through, the early 2000s up to now. So that was really, really incredible. So I was in Hong Kong for many years, and I actually worked with the government quite closely to actually build the business there. So there's an organization called Invest Hong Kong, which was super pivotal in helping us recruit staff and get office space, and really, really impressed with that. And, so we grew the business to about 100 people. And as a result of that, I moved over to the US about nearly 10 years ago now to run the operations of this company here. And the business was essentially video streaming apps. So they worked for companies like Netflix and Fox and HBO to build their apps. So super cool time to be in that business. But then, so I moved over to the US as the first employee in the US as well. So starting from scratch, but the organization was much bigger at that time. And we built that up. We opened an office in Los Angeles and New York and Guadalajara in Mexico. And so I had got a real taste for growth and, just the excitement of building something from nothing, but also the concern of worrying about payroll. There's been many times where I've come to that point. But I was sitting in my office one day in Palo Alto, and we're just about to sell this Swedish company to a private equity firm. And in walks an Australian entrepreneur by the name of David McKeague, who I think we both know.
We do.
And he was looking for some app development work from my company, but we got to talking, and I ended up joining that company, and that was Incoming Media. And that was artificial intelligence, at its core, very, very smart people. Ended up joining that and going on that journey. And that gave me my first taste of Australian entrepreneurship and meeting Australian investors as well. We had a really great cap table. We had Warner Music and Citrix and Intel, and as well as One Ventures and others. So very, very cool experience. And that got acquired. And got acquired again most recently by Maysim. So that was really, really fantastic. But along the way, I realized that this is what I want to be doing. I don't think, nothing against large companies, but I don't think they'd have me at this point. I think I'm too much of an independent entrepreneur. But it did get me thinking about what I want to do and what my children, what I want them to do over the next, 30 or 40 years. And so that led me to, starting a consulting business and working with different companies about US market entry, and that's brought me to today. And my latest project with Curious Thing, which is a really exciting AI company.
So that's fascinating. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that. So the experience in Asia would have given you a sense of East and West. It would have given you a pace at which would be unfamiliar in Australia. And it would have also given you a sense of how Asia reacts to Europe very differently than it does with the US. When you're looking at the current climate and you're looking at the pace of change that's happening in the US, has it slowed? Or is it as frenetic as it was when you first arrived? And what sort of a culture shock is it for Australians that are going for the first time so far into the cycle?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a couple of things there. So one thing I'll say about culture shock, there was more of a culture shock moving to the US than to Hong Kong.
Wow.
For sure. Hong Kong is in some ways like a northern suburb of Sydney. If you are, there's about 100,000 Australians there, and, it's just part of our neighborhood. But coming to the US and setting up from scratch is very, very different. And it is a different place. We might be familiar with it from television or whatever growing up, but, it is a very different society to Australia. It's a much more complex society. It's a much less stable society as well.
Okay.
And it's probably a harsher environment, quite frankly, than Australia. So it's and that's the perfect environment for an entrepreneur to thrive. And I've been here long enough that I've seen a couple of cycles, I suppose. So, you look at the 2010, I'm just looking at, Palo Alto house prices. They've done the full cycle in the 10 years or so that I've been here. Up until, say, pre-February or March, things seem to be steaming along. I mean, the economy was never doing better. There's all sorts of jobs being added every month. And, I felt the startup scene here was pretty robust as it's ever been. It's harder to say now. I know people are investing still and things are happening still because I see, companies announcing funding rounds, but because all my social interaction now is done by Zoom and, it's a bit different. But, from Australians coming here, I'm trying to circle back to the start of your question. There's a lot to unpack there, but just you have to prepare yourself for something that may look like a little bit like Australia, but is really nothing like it from a systemic and structural way. It's a completely different place, and you just have to be prepared for that.
Talk to me about the differences. Talk to me about what you've learned over the years, and help me understand how you navigate and how you suggest people navigate through the differences.
The one thing I love about the US is they are welcome to anyone to come in and talk to you about an idea or sell them an opportunity. Like as an Australian coming here without really much of a network, the fact that I was able to go into some of the biggest, Fortune 500 companies and do deals and build a network is a testament to how open they are about ideas from anywhere. Right. Which is, I think, part of its strength. And that comes from an underlying self-confidence. Yeah. And to understand a little bit about American self-confidence, it helps to be the parent of American children. Right. and see how that's instilled from a very young age. Like I really do. But when I go and see my kids in class and the way they're up speaking and the way they're interacting with adults is not something that I was ever doing. And it's maybe times are different now in Australian schools, but 40 years ago or whatever, it was very, very different. And just there is a sense of confidence, I think, that Americans have. And that, I think, gives them a platform to embrace things from all over the world. And this, where I live here in the Bay Area, is one of the most culturally diverse places in the world. People don't often think about it like that, but we literally have people from everywhere. I'll go down to the park with my kids and there'll be like 6 different languages being spoken. And people think perhaps New York's like that, but here is like that. So that, and Sydney has a lot of strengths like that as well, but here is just at a different scale. So there's that openness, that confidence. And then there's the sense of just risk-taking and embracing that. I know that people speak a lot about, fear of failure, or Australia's more conservative, but we haven't had to take the sort of risks. I don't think we've been very lucky the way, our economy's structured, the way our society is structured, that there has been, really stable career paths and, you know, for a long time we're isolated and now we're more open, but that sense of competition, that's the other thing, of course, is the aggressive competition. There's even 50 states that are competing with each other. You know, there's 50 tax codes and 50 different states competing for your investment dollar and to relocate your company. And then underneath that, there's all the counties and states. So just the complexity, but that breeds this competition, which I think is great. Like I really believe if you are successful in New York or Los Angeles, then you will be successful everywhere, because it does attract the best people from around the world. So there's nothing to be afraid of inviting the best people in either, might I add.
I'm really interested in exploring that whole conversation around the level and intensity of competition. Yeah. Because when you're thrown into an environment that has that level of competition, you sharpen your skills. And of course, absolutely, when you aren't in that, as you mentioned, when you aren't in that environment, when you've had 30 years of uninterrupted growth and suddenly you're facing into a collapse of your economy, or let's not be that dramatic, a reshaping of your economy, and you have to redefine it, being able to compete and knowing how to compete effectively makes the world of difference. So when you're looking at the environment, particularly from a startup perspective, this whole notion of moving fast and knowing very quickly whether you've got a market or not becomes very important. Yep. How intense is that in an environment like Silicon Valley?
It's just the right level of intensity. It's extremely intense, and that's exactly what you want, because it does prevent you from wasting too much of your time or other people's money on something that's not going to work. And the idea of failing fast, but not necessarily, I don't think you necessarily fail. You're going to grow as an entrepreneur and you're going to learn a whole heap. So whether the business was successful or not is sort of secondary to that, but you'll definitely be a better leader and entrepreneur for doing it. But the whole idea that you can put something into market very quickly, especially if it's software, and you'll find a bunch of people here that you can talk to about it who are open to giving feedback, like from corporates down to, you know, small and medium enterprises to investors to other kind of users. They will tell you if your product is going to work or not very quickly. There's a few people that ignore that advice and keep going and are successful regardless. All right, of course, any success, if you really look at the statistics, any sort of success in the entrepreneurial game, you're an outlier, quite frankly, and especially to you know, become a company like a Canva or an Atlassian or, you know, any number of startups here, you really are on the edge of the standard deviations, right? You're all the way out to the right because you've potentially ignored things or seen things that you haven't. But regardless, you'll still get traction one way or another very quickly, which is the exciting thing. So that's why I really think it's important for Australian companies to get over here if that's, you know, their goal, to be a global business, and just test your market out here and see what sort of feedback you get. Because
so these incredibly successful organisations that are growing have a new problem, and that's finding the right sort of staff and being able to attract talent from anywhere. But also to make sure that you don't miss out because you haven't, because your recruiting procedures are arcane. Now, there's technology that's now being used to help HR teams, and obviously Curiousing is one of those. Talk to me about how that works. Talk to me about the benefit of going down this path as opposed to the traditional path.
Yeah, look, so the automation of the recruiting process is something that works really well in high volume recruiting scenarios. So AI at the moment is not going to replace the judgment of a recruiter or, you know, a human being. The human being should be left to do what they do best, which is engage with candidates and, you know, move them through the process. But if you can employ some sort of automation, which is what AI is, to cast the net really wide, to give everyone a fair, even opportunity to apply for the role, to be assessed fairly in a way that completely respects diversity and opportunity, and then with that data, let the recruiter make the judgments and about who to carry forward. So I think, and that works really well in high volume roles. So we have a client here who's recruiting 25,000 people in the next 60 days. So that's interesting. But this is the high volume, you know, the contact center, that sort of stuff, support staff. which is one of the biggest industries here. It actually employs over 3 million people. It's about 3% of the workforce work in call centers.
Wow.
But the downside of that, that's a $9 to $13 an hour job,
Right.
right? So, but a lot of those people maybe don't even have resumes, or, you know, they can't get to make an appointment during business hours. So if you're given an opportunity to, you know, do the call at 9 o'clock after the kids have gone to bed, have a conversation that really captures your strengths and, you know, adds more dimension to you, rather than being a bunch of dot points on a resume.
Yep.
And quite honestly, you know, a lot of companies are foregoing resumes anyway, especially for that. They just need to fill seats. And, you know, they understand that these people won't be working there forever. But I mean, that's really huge. So just to cast that net a little bit wider and let as many people apply, because yes, it's a $9 an hour job, which is unthinkable in Australia, but there's plenty of those here. America is not a bed, it's a ladder, they say, right? So you've got to start somewhere.
Yep.
And it's just getting people that first rung on the ladder, which I really like about that. So that's really the application for especially curious things technology. I mean, there's more sophisticated use cases as well, but that's really where we're going to drive the volume. And that technology was all invented in Australia, which I'm very proud of.
That's phenomenal. So in terms of the sort of work that you're talking about, that can be done remotely. It doesn't have to be done on premises. Is that what you're seeing? Are companies tapping into the remote workforce?
Yeah, so that's an exciting opportunity now. So work has always been done remotely or offshored. And now there's a couple of factors driving like an even higher adoption of that, and people perhaps, you know, rethinking their recruitment strategies entirely. I mean, just in the microcosm of the Bay Area, Facebook is saying that, you know, large percentage of their workforces don't have to come in anymore to their office. You'll find most of them do want to come back in. That's one of the, people talk a lot about a new normal, and, you know, I have a few opinions about that. I think largely I wouldn't be too concerned long term if I was a commercial landlord. People do need that sort of, you know, face-to-face interaction. People will come back to the office. But more broadly speaking, when I think about where companies are actually choosing to do their high value R&D and the high value product development. Now, traditionally, that might all have to be done here because there was the right number of PhDs or computer scientists or computational linguistics. They were clustered, and there's a bunch of smart people here, and they keep coming here from all around the world. Now that has potentially slowed down and is causing people to rethink all sorts of things. So yes, the H-1B skilled worker scheme has been suspended temporarily. Yeah, there's always been pressure on that to reduce that. And I think there's deeper questions and around in Australia as well as why do we need to import so much skills and talent and stuff? But, you know, some of the greatest companies here have been founded by people on those very visas. So, you know, it's an interesting thing, but say that's paused, and say, you know, I'm a CTO or someone in charge of product development, I'm casting my eye around the world and where can I get stuff done?
Yes.
Not generic stuff, not, you know, $20 an hour web development, really deep tech product development. Yeah. And Australia keeps coming up more and more in conversations I'm having with people. I'm working with a really interesting new broadband startup here. You know, ultimately it'll be a $3 billion project. And they came to me and said, you know, I've heard about some work being done at Macquarie Uni, and this is really, really what we're interested in doing. And I think we need to do some of this work in Australia. And it's attractive because the stability that we have. It's attractive because of our exchange rate. Yep. And it's attractive because it's almost like a shiny new object. You know, I think you talk about, you know, perhaps needing to restructure the economy. And I really think it's day one in Australia for that, because our profile as a country is actually much lower. Yes. We think it's high. Yes. But, you know, I talk to people, they don't know anything about Australia. They literally don't. Yep. You know, not just people in, you know, New York or Los Angeles, but all over the country. They really don't have much of an idea what we're all about, which is hugely exciting. I show them a picture of surfers' paradise, and they think it's, you know, either Rio or Miami or something. They're really unaware of places like this that exist. And despite our, you know, many hundreds of millions of dollars on tourism ads over the years and stuff, and that's completely fine. Once people do figure that out, plus they figure out there's a bunch of really smart people, and there's some really smart R&D research, then that's going to be huge for us. You know, I think about the top 50 companies are going to spend $400 billion on R&D this year, the top 50 R&D spenders. But under that, there's probably another $500 million on all the way down the list. $500 billion all the way down the list, right, of people, hundreds of different companies with really, really interesting projects that they might not be able to staff in their home countries, especially the US. I'm just talking mid-tier companies. A mid-tier company here is like a $3 to $5 billion company, $10 billion company.
Yeah.
If they were made aware of what we can do for them, and if Australia branded itself well around specific skill sets, then that, I think, is really, really huge. It's not going to replace, $200 billion worth of trade with China overnight, but, year by year, if we can just grab 0.1% of that global R&D and then eventually 1% of that, it has two really good effects. Number one, we get exposure and deep integration into the global and especially the US technology supply chain. So we just go to place. Number two, it actually trains the next generation of product leaders. So they get exposure without leaving Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne to this global workforce or this global kind of workflow. And then from there, they get to go and, hopefully start their own companies and get inspired to do something entrepreneurial, but they're getting first class, exposure and training. And that's the thing over the next 5 to 10 years, I think, is a real opportunity. I don't think things are going to be volatile from now until forever, quite frankly, and they always have been. But I think Australia's really been an oasis of calm and stability, but with huge advantages that I know we've been shouting about them, but it feels like from over here, it feels like a whisper. And there's so much more we could do.
So this is a really interesting part of the conversation for a number of reasons. When you look at Israel, when you look at Ireland, when you look at Estonia or Toronto, there are 5 key elements, and one of those is the attraction of global R&D hubs to do exactly what you've just said. Mm-hmm. And the competition for those in the past was very stiff, but I'm really interested by the comments that you make, because obviously COVID has given us a new opportunity, and that is, we've got the curve under control. It's a safe place to exist. If you've got a team or if you've got work that is high risk and of high impact and high importance to an organisation, it's a great place to quarantine those people and that work.
Yeah.
Because it can continue, it won't be disrupted, right?
Exactly. I mean, Australia must be one of the most stable countries in the world. And I think we're a much calmer set of people, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's not, when I say R&D as well, so it's not the, deep science in the lab. It's really just their run-of-the-mill product development and doing the next generation of iteration of product. And that to me is super exciting, because we have great R&D centres in our universities. I think that's fairly well known amongst, those circles. But the fact that we can translate that into products and, be commercially focused and execute on it is the next step there. And that's really going to be amazing for us. And I think, the parallels with Montreal and Toronto and Israel, they've really done well at branding themselves around specific verticals.
Yes.
And I think, we can do that as well. We don't really want to take it all on, and there's no reason why we should, but, we have the capacity to go deep in, a certain number of areas. I mean, I'm sure there's many more, but, I think about just our there's 5,000 computer science students right now at UNSW, all churning away. And, there's a really broad set of skills that you can take from computer science and mathematics and economics and linguistics and put that together to make really amazing teams that can do world-class work. That's what I'm convinced of. And that's, definitely my thesis for the next sort of 10 years with Australian business.
I completely agree with you. And I want to add to that the fact that we have what's thought to be 1 million Australians living and working overseas. Mm-hmm. And DFAT's just reported that 300,000 of them have come home. Now, some of those are obviously travellers, but a lot aren't. Yeah. And so that talent pool that we're starting to see at Advance is the sophisticated talent pool that has chosen to accelerate their return home, now looking for opportunities here in Australia for work that they were doing overseas. And as you know, not all of that work has traditionally been available here. Yeah. So the ability to attract the R&D, the product development that you're talking about, would be ideal, because not only have they got the stability, the organisations have the stability of the health system and our ability to manage COVID. They've also got they've now got this pool of talent that is globally trained that could slot in and they wouldn't notice a difference. So there's a lot to be a lot to be celebrated. And of course, the university talent that we've got, that we're producing, is of it's great quality. So it's what it's saying. I think the question that I've got for you then is, what will it take to attract them? What kind of conversations do we have to be having, and with who? And is it a government conversation or is it a private sector conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, my role, I think governments are great at creating the environment and then letting the private sector do what it does best. So in many cases, it's just, you know, either getting out of the way or just creating the right set of conditions from a, you know, taxation and legal and all the things that governments do best. And, you know, there's nothing wrong, quite frankly, as a nation with having industrial policy around technology. If I look at, you know, the start of Silicon Valley, it was embedded with the US government's industrial policy, starting with military, and then it was for many, many years. And Japan's the same, and of course China's the same. And actually most successful companies, businesses in a really strong partnership with government. So there's nothing absolutely wrong with that. So government has a big part to play. But, you know, the best framework for actually executing is with private enterprise who can go out there and actually create, or, you know, make contacts in the US, bring that work back. I think it's fantastic that there's people want to come home. I think there's two reasons for that. One is, yes, just the environment we're in. And two, if you've been away for a long time like I have, you start to get to that point in your life where you'd rather be in Australia than over here or anywhere else. Plus, you sort of see, I'm very grateful for being in the US for so long because I've learned so much and it's been great for me. But now I really want to come back at some point and share it with everyone else and, you know, lift Australia up to that level, which is really exciting.
So that is exciting because I'm quite looking forward to you coming back and building your next company here and
Yeah.
you know, being successful here, because in many ways that's what we're looking for, looking at Advance to help in a sense that if we know that people are coming home, what we want to do is start working with them from the moment they decide that it's, you know, 12 months out or 18 months out, and connecting you up with the ecosystem back here, because it's been a while, 10 years away from the Australian ecosystem.
Yeah,
you know, there are connections and networks. Exactly. It's like you're an immigrant coming home. So it's
well, I have been lucky, like, because I was the CEO of an Australian company at least at one point. So I was, you know, going back to Australia 6 or 8 times a year at one point. And now this is the longest time in my life I've been outside of the country. It's been nearly, I suppose, 18 months now. Far too long, far too long. But yeah.
So in terms of, so when you do come back, when you think about building your company back in Australia, what will that look like? What will you be looking for as an entrepreneur that wants to succeed in our ecosystem?
Yeah, so obviously the number one thing is access to talent, right? So all businesses now are people businesses, and, you know, they live or die by the quality of people. That's the primary input. But, you know, another thing is having a decent cost base. It's so important. And, you know, I like the fact that Sydney is, you know, they're putting the new technology precinct there, you know, by UTS with that Atlassian building. I think that's fantastic. But I think one of the issues in Australia, and this is another nice contrast with the US, Australia is very, very concentrated. And America is more diverse and spread out, and it can actually do things in the regional areas. So, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, perhaps you need a presence in Sydney as well, but the regional areas of Australia as well. You know, I'm thinking specifically of the Brisbane to Gold Coast corridor is a really, you know, there's great universities, great lifestyle. And so actually, you know, having the right sort of cost base, even in comparison to Sydney, and a place that, you know, is attractive enough to attract talent. So that's super, super cool. I think I also plan to be spending, you know, a lot of time in the US. I need to be able to fly again as well, because this is
it's a big challenge.
This is where the customers are going to be, right? So, you know, we do need to get through this period. But, you know, I think, to be honest, we're starting to build a couple of quite a few really nice world-class technology companies. So the people with that sort of growth experience are going to be there. They're still very rare. I was talking to an HR person or head of talent from a VC in Australia, and her portfolio companies come to her asking for someone who's gone from 0 to 1 billion and scaled to 200 million users, and they just don't exist, or if they do, I mean, they're too busy doing other things. Perhaps they're on their yacht or something. So there's not that sort of population of really skilled people. So the idea that there is an overseas population of people like me, and definitely more skilled, but could come back, and that's going to be super important as well, to have that sort of global mindset and global experience, and be used to working at the pace and the intensity and the level of competition as well, and just the having some experience in the cut and thrust of the US or European or Asian markets is super critical as well. But it all comes down to people.
Look, I think that's true. We're negotiating an FTA with the UK, and another one that's going to hit with the EU. So there's a focus on new markets in that regard, and there's also obviously India sitting at our doorstep, where that market is opening up in a way that we haven't seen for a while. How much of your trade at the moment, or how much of your business involves work with those markets, the UK, the European, the Indians?
Yeah, nothing right now. So which is huge. The work I'm doing at Curious Thing is definitely just focused in the US, because this is, we're a very, very small company, and quite frankly, there's enough here to keep us going. And that's the attraction of the US market. But yeah, there's a few conversations happening in Europe as well. But my focus, that's another interesting thing, because the world is so large, you can have a different geographic focus, but mine would definitely be on the Pacific, and both sides of it, and that includes certain parts of Asia, which I think is really, really interesting. I actually don't know much about, and this is the other thing, unless you read the Australian every day, which I do, but we don't hear a lot about the FTA between Australia and Europe, or Australia and the UK, because you've watched the news here before, you know what's on, right?
Yeah.
But and I think that's a great opportunity. I think everywhere should have a FTA with everywhere else. Quite frankly, that's super critical.
We make it happen. So I've just got one question for you in terms of students. The young are adversely affected and acutely impacted by the COVID pandemic. But I also believe that there's tremendous hope, in a sense that a whole new markets are opening up for them, and they may need to reskill, but they're certainly young enough to pivot their careers. What's your suggestion for those who may need to shift their focus from careers that they had begun? Where do you see the opportunities for the young?
Well, so they will definitely have to shift no matter what. And it's really interesting to get your first pivot out of the way early, because if I think of a graduate graduating this summer from university, they're looking at least a 50-year career ahead of them, right? The retirement age and just the longevity, right? There's a 20th century model that we're working on now, which was people died relatively young and retired at 65, and that was fine. That needs to go away. And as soon as people start thinking about, well, I'm actually going to have not just one career, but maybe 5 10-year careers, or 10 5-year careers. So your whole career is going to be a tale of constantly pivoting, constantly reskilling, constantly learning. So if that's what it's in front of you now, get used to it, because that's what's going to keep happening for the next half century, if not longer. I mean, we might all live to 100. I mean, not necessarily me, but my kids for sure. I mean, they're going to have the way they think about their careers in life is going to be in such longer terms. The time frame is going to be completely different. So yes, you might be looking at a short-term pivot or sideways move now because of COVID, but there'll be another 10 COVIDs, pandemics, recessions, and everything else in the next decades to come. So embrace it, because that's how it's going to be. That is something that's going to happen. And someone gave me a book the other day called The 100-Year Life, which is really just starting to reorientate society around the idea of living for a long, long time. But even now, it doesn't matter if you've got a 50-year or 20-year career, what you learned at university will be obsolete fairly quickly. So, and circumstances and economy and environment all going to change. So you have to aggressively stay in front of it. And that's something else I'm passionate about as well, because you'll have on one hand, at the bottom end, the machines and the AI taking a lot of jobs. And at the top end as well, you're just going to have this constant state of flux of skills that are jobs that didn't exist in 5 years ago won't exist in 5 years' time. And there'll be this constant need to reinvent and reskill. So there's a huge opportunity in that.
And then in terms of that reskilling, is it the traditional route? Is it, back to university with a 4-year degree, or is the reskilling much more in the micro-credentialing and the self-motivated learning?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to be self-motivated. I don't think people have the time or money you can't take the break out of your career for that time. But yeah, part-time study, but just, learning and development as a way of life, like every single week, like no more on Friday than you did on Monday, and you will eventually be successful. It just has to be ingrained in the way we operate, and that's how companies need to think as well, because they end up having to make 2,000 people or 5,000 people redundant because they were surplus to that business's requirements. But if they'd taken a view of, and eventually they might hire many of them back as well, which is a shame, but if they'd taken the view of, well, we know no matter what, if the economy is good or bad, this set of skill sets isn't probably going to be there in several years' time. And so what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go through the expense of, retrenching and then rehiring and retraining? Or are we just going to embed that into our operating plan? We need to keep reinventing our people, because you can't change a company without changing the people, right? People have to keep growing. You can't grow a company without growing the people. And that's really critical. Part of that is learning. Most of it is learning.
And I'll bring it full circle, and that makes the ability of these new recruiting tools fundamental, because if you haven't got a ticker box approach, if you can't just say went to this university, did this course and that's enough, then you need a far more sophisticated tool to analyze whether the capability of the person matches the role.
Yeah, and not just in the recruiting process as well. Once they're on board, the whole employee life cycle, you need to keep checking in with them. And because, they might come on board perfect and ticking all the boxes on day one, but by year 3, they're at a point where they've fallen behind through no fault of their own. They've just been doing their job. So that constant, appraisal of where you need to be and those gaps versus the skills you have, that needs to be part of what HR departments and people operations are thinking about as well. Really critical.
You're almost reapplying yourself for each of the roles throughout your career. So you've got the external, as part of that journey, you've got the recruitment coming in, and then you've got the recruitment to remain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that works both ways as well. I mean, companies should keep rehiring, and the same people and people should keep reemploying. I mean, that's just the dance people are going to have to do. Yeah.
And that creates opportunity, and that's what we love. Thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously, particularly the bit about the opportunity for attracting the global R&D and the product development to Australia.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing our conversation again. See you soon.
Yeah.